Hi, I'm Sarah.
And I'm Rena.
And welcome to Biopic, a podcast story.
This is our introductory episode. Who are we and what are we doing?
We created this episode to tell you a little about us, this podcast, and the 1 to 10 scoring method we're using. If you are just tuning in the future, this is a podcast where we dissect the good, bad, ugly, and absurd of this specific genre of motion picture, the biopic. Should we maybe introduce ourselves a tiny bit before we get into this?
I'm Rena, and I love biopics. I love historical epics. I love costume dramas. I love dense, rich plotting, and anything that makes me feel like I'm being swept away into another time and place. I have a deep reverence for history that I've been told is apparent to anyone who's known me for longer than half an hour. It takes a lot of buzz, like a Succession-level buzz, to get me to watch anything set in the present day, because for me, there's not much of the sense of escape or diversion that I'm looking for in that. That said, I'm aware of the inherent flaws in the biopic genre. For example, that a person's life doesn't adhere to the rules of structure that you learn in film school or follow classic hero's journey storytelling arcs, and that life itself has ebbs and flows. If you've ever seen that graph of what success looks like versus what you think it looks like, where what you think it looks like is a straight diagonal, and what it really looks like is a scribbly thing, that is similar to the problems of telling someone's life story in a biopic. Real life is squirrely, it has ups and downs, and it is hard to mold that to get that on film. I think that some stronger biopics choose to hone in on a set period in the subject's life, but that's not necessarily the whole story, when there might be interesting moments that they had that are decades apart. To wrap it up, I have watched a lot of biopics, and I have a lot to say about them.
I pretty much share all the same instincts as you. I'm not nearly as averse to modern times, but there are specific periods of history and pieces of history that I get really nerdy about. I grew up as one of those indoor kids who was watching American movie classics and Turner Classic Movies with my mom and dad, and then I really started to get really excited about sort of the craft of filmmaking and the art of filmmaking and screenwriting. I studied film in college, and I'm like all kids who studied film in college, an amateur film scholar. And I'm really excited to talk about any movie and all of the topics that are attendant with each of those films. I love, calling out awards bait when I see it.
We've been friends for going on 20 years. Our mothers went to college together.
We share media and communications career backgrounds. I've worked in media and PR and entertainment, and we've both been watching movies for ages. We've been on vacation together. We hang out as much as we can, despite the way our lives, we're both, busy people with stuff.
I've worked in media, journalism, the art auction house world, music, publishing, and web production. We've both lived in New York for decades, and we have collectively decades of experience within that whole sphere adjacent to entertainment.
Rena, do you have a favorite biopic?
I have 3 favorite biopics and an honorable mention. What's your favorite anything is my least favorite question to get on a first date, or an early stage date, or from anyone, anywhere, on any occasion, because it puts me on the spot to be judged in a way that I dislike strongly. I don't have favorites. I have varying groups of things that are meaningful to me at different times in my life.
Fair enough.
But my 3 favorite biopics are Milk, Straight Outta Compton, and Levy and Rose, with an honorable mention for Mrs. Parker and The Vicious Circle, because that was a film that I watched somewhere between 5 or 7 times as a teenager and in college, but it is emotionally embedded in a younger version of me in a way that I really don't want to look back on that frequently. That is the answer to the question about my favorite biopic. Do you have a cluster of biopics that you feel are especially praiseworthy or are close to your heart, Sarah?
I do. I am a huge fan of Bob Fosse, and I find his early death one of the most just tragic missed opportunities that happen in the film industry, just in terms of like really not being able to see how his filmmaking career would have evolved. My personal favoriteest biopic is Star 80, and it's super tough subject matter, but it's a beautifully constructed film and really well performed, well acted, and just amazing. Hopefully we'll cover that at some point. I love Capote. I love The Aviator, and I am also on the other side of the pendulum, super passionate about the movie Tombstone, which is a biopic, but I find it also incredibly entertaining. So I would say those, and they kind of show sort of like the polarity of my weird taste in motion pictures.
I didn't know that you loved Tombstone. It's arguably the best Wyatt Earp picture, and we should do that someday and then watch the Kevin Costner Wyatt Earp so that we can rag on it.
That movie is also known as Boring Tombstone.
Interesting story. It was hard to find costumes for at least one of those movies because Tombstone and Wyatt Earp were filming at the same time, and one of them used up the 19th century American Western wardrobe supply at the big costume houses. Next, Sarah. We wanted to mention clean ratings. How do we feel about getting an explicit rating?
We don't care. I'm not here for it. I'm not here to show you how much I cannot curse at any given time. I will not be restricted.
We're not going for a clean rating because people in these films curse. And I'd rather just quote a word directly than say, I can't say this word or we'll lose our clean rating. I can't imagine anyone under 18 having any interest in listening to this show, but from what I've gathered, any Gen Zers or Gen Alphas out there long since figured out how to get around whatever internet rules their parents attempted to lay down. If you are a parent who attempts to preserve your child's innocence in this society are a fool's errand, give up. And if I had a kid, I wouldn't care if they cursed so long as they knew how to use an M dash, an N dash, and a hyphen correctly.
Also, if a child or anyone under the age of 18 is very interested in hearing us talk about the movies Wonderland or Mank or Raging Bull, then you know what? They're ready to hear swear words too.
The Wolf of Wall Street should be required for peak viewing for toddlers. I'm honestly more offended if I hear someone mangle there, and there, or where, were, and where, or if someone can't recognize a Fibonacci sequence, than I am if I hear one of George Carlin's 7 words he can't say on the radio. And if you think that's pretentious, well then I was born pretentious. You're only pretentious if you're pretending. I genuinely love and care about this stuff. I would be pretentious if I were pretending that I was all down home.
Truly, you are not down home.
Not at all, Sarah.
A word about spoiler warnings.
We are going to spoil everything.
Can you elaborate on why that is necessary?
I am so happy to do that, Sarah. The spoilers on a biopic are often similar to the ones on a biography, namely, the subject dies. In every episode of Biopic, a podcast story, we're going to spoil whatever movie we're talking about that week. And we're probably also going to spoil a ton of other books, TV shows, or films that you may not have seen and that have nothing to do with that week's subject, because it's hard to talk about anything without the plot making a difference, and plots are supposed to go somewhere, to an ending. I feel that spoiler phobia has made it impossible to have an informed conversation about any form of narrative art at this point in the 21st century. It's super annoying to be having a conversation and be impeded by someone else's spoiler phobia.
Agreed. And also, I would add that a lot of the people that we're talking about have been dead for a long time. Their stories have been out there too. So if you don't know what happened to Jim Morrison, for example, I'm sorry, we're going to ruin that for you.
If we are spoiling Lincoln, the American education system has failed you.
If we're spoiling Lincoln, you went to school in Mississippi. Sick burn, right? Anyway, we'd like to give you a sense, too, of what is and is not a biopic for the intents and purposes of this podcast. First, it must be about a person or group of people who spent enough time in the public eye that there is an idea of them for actors to imitate. Their life is in the historical record. They did something of historical and or artistic significance that warrants a big film being made about them. What is not a biopic? To start, the stories of biblical people. The Bible is a spiritual work. Much of it is relatively allegorical, and it does not count as a reliable historical record. It may be the word of God, but there's an old joke in academia, a space where I have spent no time, that God will never get tenure at the university because he has only one major publication, and it's in Hebrew.
Is unreliable as a historical document. Case in point, the Book of Ruth is a story about a woman who really liked her mother-in-law. Thou goest, I will go. No woman in the history of the world ever said that to her mother-in-law, ever. Except in Why the Bible cannot be taken as fact and is meant to be allegorical and metaphorical. This part.
Also not a biopic. Movies based on Shakespeare plays, such as Henry V. Not a biopic to us, anyway. Not a biopic, movies that create a fictional leading character as a hook to interact with historical figures. Not a biopic, things too buried in mythology for us to know what was really going on. For example, we cannot do the Trojan War. Also, not, to us, a biopic, people who became famous because of a biopic, and people not really in the public eye, such as heartwarming tales of a teacher who inspired their students, or a sheriff who cleaned up a small town. We get to do Goodfellas for episode 100 because I really want to, even though Rena has pointed out that Goodfellas does not qualify as a biopic.
Don't think that Goodfellas is a biopic, but I'll do it if we make it to episode 100 to make you happy.
You're correct to feel that way. It is really not a biopic based on our criteria, but it is one of the best movies ever made.
Miniseries are not a biopic. We're going to stick to feature films. There are some wonderful miniseries and prestige drama series that have been made in the past 20 years that depict people's lives, but that is a lot of viewing time, and the feature film length works well for us. It works well for a weekly podcast of between 60 and 90 minutes running time.
We have a list of biopics that are purely feature films that is long enough to keep us busy for the next decade.
I'm far more interested in hitting the little obscurities or the odd corners of history than I am in immediately hitting the most popular and best-known biopics of the past 20 years. We will get to Walk the Line. We will get to Bohemian Rhapsody. We will get to Oppenheimer and Lincoln, and sooner than you might think. But we would rather focus on variety in our subject matter, the variety of eras we cover, and the eras in filmmaking that we feature. Our priority is the long game and having a well-rounded roster. This is, to a degree, also a history podcast, as well as a movie podcast, and I'm not interested in limiting ourselves to movies set in the second half of the 20th century that were made in the last 2 or 3 decades.
If we ever get through everything on that list, we can start the miniseries. When we get through this list, we can do Killing Pablo.
Yes, or George and Tammy.
I love Michael Shannon, but there's definitely biopics that he is in that are feature-length films, so we can cover those first.
So Sarah, what can we say about the history of the biopic? Because biopics have been with us since pretty much the dawn of film.
Yes, and because you are the history person, you unearthed some good information that I'll share. Filmmakers have been making biopics for nearly as long as we've been making movies. For example, Thomas Edison produced a silent short called The Execution of Mary Stuart in 1895. However, it was 18 seconds long and cut straight to the execution. The most commonly acknowledged first narrative film, The Great Train Robbery, came out in 1903. The first sort of biopic, Australia's The Story of the Kelly Gang, came out in 1906 and is also one of the candidates for the first feature-length film. Sadly, most of the early silent biopics are now lost, but there was a Russian biopic about Peter the Great in 1910, and then 1911's Sweet Nell of Old Drury Lane about Charles II's arguably most famous mistress, Nell Gwynn. Rather than recite a chronological list of silent biopics and which ones survive, I'll zero in on the highlights. 1915, the same year that saw the release of the cinematically revolutionary but also racist, societally poisonous, and historically inaccurate classic Birth of a Nation, also included biopics about Edgar Allan Poe, Florence Nightingale, and yet another Nell Gwynn story, which starred Mary Pickford. And the MoMA has a print of that. So biopics have developed in tandem with other genres and have attracted top talent from the get-go.
We make and watch biopics because it's easy to generate interest in a fascinating story that already exists. They can be visually stunning with gorgeous sets and costume porn galore. And when I say costume porn, it's not about taking the costumes off. It's about the costumes being gorgeous and staying firmly on the body to be admired and inspire probably misguided romantic thoughts of how beautiful everything used to be back before penicillin and indoor plumbing. Sarah, can you talk about some of the problems of the biopic, which we already sort of got into?
As you mentioned, real people's lives do not follow a classic, concise hero's journey arc. Actors in biopics often deliver some serious scenery chomping in their performances, and biopics can be really formulaic. Most of all, there are a lot of common tropes that you see repeatedly in biopics. A caveat here that these tropes occur because they are part of a real person's dramatic life journey. But the important part is that they tell them in a way that feels original. So, for example, the traumatic loss of a sibling, parent, or role model, the shots cutting from the child actor to the real star of the film, exposition trains of telling and not showing, that slide into substance abuse and recovery script, and then where it's just moment after moment after moment. Then there's the lost loved one or childhood self reappears to indicate personal evolution and spiritual approval. I would also add the parent or close family member or friend or partner who reminds the title character that they're never going to get anywhere or that they're never going to become the thing that they want to become. Usually with that is that spouse holding them back. So sometimes it's a husband, sometimes it's a wife, but they want that conventional life. They want that person at home putting food on the table or making money. And as a result of that, they don't believe in them. And usually that means that the subject needs to find someone who does.
One interesting thing that happens repeatedly with biopics that we'd like to call out is Hollywood's habit of producing two around the same subject within a year of each other.
Sometimes it seems like there's something in the ether that makes everyone want to cover a certain story at a certain time. A certain life story gets so hot that multiple studios get biopics in development at the same time, and voila, fraternal twin Truman Capotes. That's how we have 7 Years in Tibet and Kundan in 1997. We have two Jean Harlow biopics, both terrible, both starring women named Carol Lindley and Carol Baker in 1965. Two Wyatt Earp films in the same year in the 90s. Two Prefontaine films in the same year. Truman Capote writing the book In Cold Blood in the same year. It's just something like there's vibes that people will pick up and end up making the same movies. And often there's a lot of similar shots and notes in those, and it can be really amusing and amazing to see.
And this is another thing that has been happening once or twice a decade since biopics became a thing, which, as we've said, is since the dawn of film. Sometimes it's not quite the same year, but a few years apart. For example, multiple Nell Gwynn pictures in the 19-teens.
Which, why? Who? What?
That mistress of Charles II, she was a very popular subject in our great-grandmother's eras, Sarah.
I guess. And moving on, we're going to do a trigger warning on this show.
I was inspired on this by Andrew Peggy's podcast, A History of Rock Music in 500 Songs. At this point, that podcast has me so desensitized to the trigger warning that when I hear it and the list of things that he's warning a listener about, I rub my hands together like Mr. Burns and think, ooh, juicy, juicy shade, in anticipation of all the awful stuff that I'm about to hear about famous people on this podcast.
Rita will typically list everything that qualifies for a trigger warning in a film, and then I might think of one more thing to add, but she's usually pretty complete on it.
We'd like to help to destigmatize the trigger warning and make it a breezy element of basic politeness.
I love it. So, to the rating system, we have a 10 criteria rating system. Rena, maybe you can talk a little bit about where this rating system came from.
I first heard a rating system used on a podcast called Pontifex, where they rate, rank, and review all the popes from Peter to Francis. I love the rapport between the two women who do that podcast. And I love that they have something besides their basic subjectivity to rate people on. After discovering Pontifex, I learned that this was not the first podcast to do that. It's part of a whole slew of historical podcasts dubbed the Lexipods that includes Totalis Rankium for Roman emperors, for example. The big daddy of all of them is one called Rex Factor. First it did the kings of England and Great Britain, then it did the kings of Scotland. It's currently doing the consorts of England. I know that this sounds very nerdy, but that's why they're called the Rexipods. And I thought, this is something that we could apply to this sort of historical thing that also has a degree of artistry around it. It could be a way to get fair ratings because people use a lot of grade inflation when ranking things. The reason why 7 and 8 have no meaning now is because people are afraid to flex the full 110 scale and give a 3, 4, or 5 when it's duly earned.
The 10 things that we rate on, let's go over them. First, outward appearances such as hair and makeup. Second, acting and casting. Do they capture the spirit of the people they are playing? And beyond that, is the acting any good?
Third, costuming, which is a big part of what makes these films luscious to look at.
4, passage of time, which can be things like how are they showing how much time has passed? Because a biopic can be a biopic can be a group biopic that covers a few days out of the lives of a group of individuals around a historical event. It can be about one person where it's their whole life. It can be about, say, a famous married couple, but you want to have a sense of how much time is going by. That also includes aspects of things pertaining to other categories like aging and showing wear and tear on household items.
It's a little complicated, but when it's done badly, boy, do you feel it.
Is the film giving you the cues you need to know that time has actually passed? That can be as simple as title cards or newspapers or what have you. Sometimes you watch a movie and you're like, has a week gone by, a month, 20 years? I have no idea.
5th, quality of the script.
In this case, we're looking at sort of how is the writing in terms of the dialogue? Does it feel real? Is it germane to the people having the conversation? How is that moving the story along? Does it highlight the right characters and tell their story? If the script came across your desk as an actor, would you pick it up and want to make this movie?
6th, accuracy.
How well do they tell the story in terms of getting the facts right? Do they manage to convey the truth of what happened? Is it reflective of the reality of the situation?
That we will ever give a 10 for accuracy. If we did, it would probably be a long, dull, digressive film. I want to distinguish here between lying by omission and choosing to cut a series of events that are tangential to the main flow. If you shoehorn them in, you're looking at a case where the reaction is, this movie was too long and tried to cram in too much. When you make a biopic, you're looking at a collective 1.5 to 4 hours of moments in possibly decades of someone's life. There's a difference between leaving something out and adding interactions with fictional people or events that never happened. For example, Milk failing to show the reaction to Jonestown.
I swear you're putting this in here so I won't talk about it for like 45 minutes on the Milk episode. But yes, this is an excellent example of something that was happening at the same time that was a source of a lot of trauma and drama and issues happening in San Francisco concurrent to Harvey Milk and George Moscone's assassination. However, adding it to the film would add weight to the runtime. It would add additional context that isn't necessary for the narrative flow of the story. And it would be a confusing element to just throw on the table at the end of the third act of a film.
Thank you for that, Sarah. One of the gifts of peak TV was the ability to tell a life story and include the things that would be a digression in a feature film, because you could tell the story in 8 to 12 one-hour episodes, for example. But even HBO's John Adams had to leave things out. If you followed the demands for all-inclusive accuracy to an extreme endpoint, you could wind up with Andy Warhol presents Abe Lincoln's Sleep. And I would doubt the verity of that picture because President Lincoln was a documented insomniac.
Would 100% watch, however, especially if it were Daniel Day-Lewis playing him. He would be so convincing to watch trying to sleep. And Andy Warhol presents Abe Lincoln's Sleep. If such a film were to exist, we're talking about a lot of time travel and other things that would cause that to happen. But I'm interested in what you're talking about, and I want to hear more about this idea.
So you are the dream market for Andy Warhol presents Abe Lincoln's Sleep.
I would probably end up giving it like an absurdly high rating because I am a sucker for all things. I would be able to tell you why it mattered and why it was important, and probably talk about like the shifts that happen in time throughout it and what they symbolize. Because I was a communications major and we made up a lot of things on the fly.
Number 7, storytelling. Was it cliche? Was it interesting? One thing we found is that if something loses points on accuracy, it may pick them up on storytelling. For example, if somebody had 12 kids, it's okay to only hire 8 child actors. We will dock you, but we will put those points back in for story flow. Probably.
But if you've got 12 child actors in your movie, I don't want to see it. 8th, production value. Are you seeing the money on the screen? Is it beautiful to look at? If it needs to be beautiful to look at? Are you seeing a lot of quality outdoor shots? Does it look real and period authentic, specifically avoiding distracting anachronisms? Are you seeing real people? We're kind of suckers for seeing practical effects in actual human beings. Are they using the money that they had in the budget to make a motion picture that has beauty to it? Is it well lit? That's a real problem these days. Always nice if a movie's well lit. How do the actors look? Do they look good? Are they shot well? Is the film edited beautifully? Does the production have the appearance of a high quality?
9th criteria, direction, production, decision-making. Were the people involved making the best decisions? Production direction replaced a category called ego surrender that you may have heard in the first few episodes that we're not doing anymore, because we needed something that would encompass the decisions of everyone in the film, not just the actors. In case you're interested, ego surrender, our dead category, was created to penalize actors who insist on doing their own singing in musical biopics, when they are just plain not as talented or as distinctive a singer or musician as whoever they're portraying. This is a complaint that you will probably hear from me about every 5th episode or so. It goes back to a question that plagued me many years ago. Namely, why would you pay money for a soundtrack of Joaquin Phoenix and Reese Witherspoon singing as Johnny and June Carter Cash when the real thing is readily available? Unless the lead actor is genuinely 100% as talented as whoever they're portraying and can do the perfect imitation of their style, I'd rather see well-executed lip-syncing and get to hear the real version of whatever made them special enough to warrant a biopic in the first place. However, we got rid of ego surrender and replaced it with something that took more of a 360 approach to examining the decisions made in the making of these movies, because ego surrender wound up being, well, you'll hear it in the first 3 episodes or so. Ego surrender wound up being a way of giving actors double brownie points for showing up and doing their jobs and things that are already covered in the acting category.
Maybe someone destroyed the category and murdered it forever when they gave Caligula a 9 out of 10 for ego surrender,
thus egregiously throwing off the score for Caligula. An excruciating movie to sit through. A certain somebody who was not named Rena and Sara, and that's when we knew that ego surrender needed to be replaced.
The 10th and final is criteria. And then the 10th and final criteria is, do we care? Do we care about these people? Do we care about them in terms of their humanity? Do we care about the story that's being told? Does it matter? Do we want to know more about these people? Or are they coming off as hobgoblins and trolls and as fan service ciphers of someone else's own creation, and we want them to just go away as quickly as possible? So that would be, do we care?
Everything is scored from 0 to 10, with 10 being the highest. We add everything together and divide by 10. One could say, why don't you just make it out of 100? But we aren't a wine magazine. All you need to do is move a decimal point. People like little numbers, and people like saying, on a scale of 1 to 10. We never, ever share our scores with each other in advance in order to avoid influencing each other's scores. And we have a concept called the buy point, where prior to sharing our scores and our average with each other, we are allowed to either add or subtract a point from the individual score if we feel that the score that we reached was not reflective of our overall enjoyment. Nothing will ever score lower than a 0 or above a 10. If for some reason something scores very high and then we each use a positive buy on it, or very low and then we each use the negative buy on it, it'll just cancel to 0 or 10.
We may end up revisiting this because math is hard.
That's not even math, Sarah. It's barely arithmetic. It's not even algebra. It's some addition and moving a decimal point.
As an example of what would get a 0 in a given category, if a human interacts with a dinosaur and it's not a dream sequence, the film will get a 0 for accuracy.
That's a special case that we call the dinosaur rule.
The dinosaur rule was inspired by The Conqueror, which stars John Wayne as Genghis Khan. There are no dinosaurs in The Conqueror, but we thought the only way it could get more inaccurate would be if they had a dinosaur actually wander through the Gobi Desert to interact with John Wayne, playing a Mongolian who lived 800 plus years ago. Because at one point there were dinosaurs in the Gobi Desert. And why should movie producers care about dusty old concepts like geological timescale?
I do not know if we will ever need to use the dinosaur rule.
There's a lot of movies on that list. That's all I'll say. And Jesus had rocks thrown at him by a baby dinosaur.
Remember, we would not be watching or rating a movie where a baby dinosaur throws rocks at Jesus, because movies about Jesus and other biblical people do not count as biopics for the purpose of this podcast, as we explained about half an hour ago.
Fair enough. There's a term we use a lot, and that is the easy E level cry. Do you want to explain what that is?
You'll hear us use this term rather frequently. Sure, because you'll hear us use this term rather frequently. Eazy-E was a member of the gangster rap group NWA, and about 9 years ago, we saw the NWA biopic Straight Outta Compton together. At the end of it, tears were rolling down our face because, spoiler, Eazy-E died of AIDS. I wanted them to go back to being NWA again so badly and not be messed with by this manager who was definitely not a mensch. We never would have wept for Eazy-E without Straight Outta Compton. We were crying because Straight Outta Compton so brought us to its wavelength. Eazy-E was a thug. He was not somebody who I ever would have imagined myself weeping over. He was not a great person, but we had tears rolling down our faces. I remember honking my nose clean. We were sitting there sobbing, and am I remembering correctly that we were holding hands? Straight Outta Compton set our personal shared benchmark for crying at a movie.
We may have been holding hands. We were sobbing and we were inconsolable. And also, did that movie really come out 9 years ago?
2015, and it is now May of 2024 as we sit here recording this.
That is going to make me Eazy-E level cry as well. Dre going to visit Eazy-E when he was dying of AIDS, I sobbed uncontrollably on the train on the way home.
Really? I didn't know that you kept crying on the train on the way home.
Couldn't hold it together for the rest of the day.
Oh, man. And that is an Eazy-E level cry. I wanted so much for them, for NWA to get back together, and I never cared about rap in the 90s.
I hope they forgave each other in real life. I wonder if that's true or not. I have no idea.
A little bit about how we prepare for episodes.
Rena usually reads a lot, and I usually Google something and find a listicle and maybe read the Wikipedia page about a subject. I kind of depend on her to be the intellectual about the subject matter we're covering, and I also will spend some time on IMDb about it.
We start the episode with Sara reading the Wikipedia about the film's subject and the film. It does not care about a subject. When I care about a subject, I dislike needing to be succinct, and am easily seduced by tangents, so it is easier to have Sara read the Wikipedia. Also, we might be different degrees of busy each week, or it might be a film where I don't really care about the subject matter. For example, we flip a little sometimes when it comes to around the late 20th century. Because Sara loves Jonestown, and I'm way more interested in 970 than in 1970. Sometimes there will be subjects where I've been passionate about them for years, so I already know that, and I'm excited to pour myself into learning more. Sometimes I'll have checked out a book or two from the library. Sometimes I will have skimmed one book that I was able to get as an ebook from the library, and occasionally it could just be that both of us have read Wikipedia and Googled what's inaccurate. But it's our podcast. We're subjective. We are a long way from turning a profit. I'm not getting paid to get you a professorial level of knowledge about the subject every week. We are all about not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, and it is more important to us to meet a weekly release schedule than to get it perfect every time. On another note, I try to avoid letting myself read reviews for films that I know we're going to do because I don't want my own reaction swayed by critical assessments.
I would also add, too, that as someone whose parents spent a lot of money on a liberal arts education for me to study film, in quotes, I really try and treat each of these movies like a film and try and watch them that way. That is how I'm going to position the work I do and my level of preparation.
If you want to flatten our on-microphone personas into 2 dimensions for marketing purposes, I'm the history person, and Sara is the film theory person, unless it's a week when I don't particularly care.
Exactly. Do you want to talk a little bit about Second Opinions?
Second Opinions is a feature that we ripped off from the How Did This Get Made podcast, where if a movie scores above an 8 or below a 4, we read contradictory reviews for it from the Internet Movie Database. For something that scores above an 8, we will cherry pick the 1-star review or multiple short reviews of it. For something that scores above an 8, we will cherry pick a 1-star review or multiple short reviews of it from IMDb. If it scores below a 4, we will read the 10-star review. We don't do it for the things in between, because if it's a 5, and someone else thinks it's a 5, or a 1, or a 10, you're gonna agree about at least a few things, and it's a repetitive waste of time. I love it because nothing throws me into giggle fits quite like reading a bad review of something when someone is going off about how bad it is, or laughing at someone who thinks a terrible movie is fantastic. But we blatantly ripped it off from How Did This Get Made, and thank you very much to How Did This Get Made. You're fantastic. Sara, do you want to talk about our selection process a little?
First note, diversity efforts. We will aim over time to have the demographics of our subjects match the demographics of the population of the U.S. and the English-speaking world at large within, a 5-point sampling error. And we are going to make no apologies for our diversity efforts. We don't want to just focus on the most popular blockbuster bios of the past decade. We want to really dig in and tour the entire world of biopics that are out there, big and small. We expect that our pre-compiled list of several hundred biopics will see us through the end of the decade, if not longer. Film studios have been making biopics since the dawn of movie making, and we really want to make an effort to highlight the breadth, depth, and history of the genre. To that end, at least 1 out of 5 episodes will probably cover a film made in the second or third quarter of the 20th century. Now for some possible controversy. Rena, you have a favorable attitude towards speaking ill of the dead, so I'm going to let you talk about our speaking ill of the dead code.
You may find us castigating deceased people for period-centric attitudes and behaviors that I have hoped we could move past as a society. What I want to say here is, when you say don't speak ill of the dead, how are we to learn to be better without looking at examples that we can hope to evolve from? I am pro speaking ill of the dead because they aren't here anymore. We can't hurt them. They're dead. But in death, they can still make a contribution to society via our ability to learn from the mortifying examples that they set with their racism, homophobia, misogyny, and personal brutality. Although sometimes, of course, they also loved their children and grandchildren because human beings aren't completely one thing or the other. What are some other horrible traits that people in the past had, Sarah?
Sexism, vague, expansive prejudices, and just kind of in general, sort of like that idea that really the only people who should exist are cis, white, heterosexual Christian dudes. So this is, we're going to be insulting everyone from Genghis Khan all the way to John Wayne and John Ford, and it's fine.
We can't hurt them. They're dead, but we can learn from them, and that is the grace of speaking ill of the dead.
It's fine. They're dead. The same liberal arts education that enables me to look at these things as film also enables me to hold 2 contrasting ideas in my head, like that John Ford can make a good movie and be justly praised for it, and can also be a racist, abusive monster.
It's called nuance.
It was hard, right?
Having a sense of nuance does not equal hypocrisy.
The Searchers is a great movie. John Ford beat his wife in public.
We don't want to be like John Ford.
No, we don't. We can only dream of being able to make a movie like The Searchers, but we don't want to beat up anyone in public.
Moving on, a film that you'll hear us mention a lot, especially around musical biopics, is Walk Hard, the Dewey Cox Story. It's a 2007 parody biopic that sends up the easily recognizable formulas common in biopics. It's also one of the funniest things I've ever watched.
It's especially good if you've recently seen Ray and Walk the Line. The source of the humor is that when you see the common tropes of the biopic, they're very recognizable. This is what Walk Hard, the Dewey Cox Story was about making fun of these tropes that are repeated, particularly in the musical biopic.
John C. Reilly made this movie so that nobody would ever make a formulaic biopic again. And yet people still go right on making these paint-by-numbers biopics where they do everything that Dewey Cox told us not to do.
This is also a good time to explain Trope Navajo, who we met in The Doors in episode 1. We mention him quite often in the early episodes, but our references won't make any sense unless you have listened to our episode on The Doors. Trope Navajo is the magical Native American who shows up to guide Jim Morrison. He is a not subtle symbol of Jim Morrison's spirit. He appears in that film every time a major formulaic trope of the biopic happens, like the drug downfall, the fight with partners, the rock bottoms, etc. He ultimately helps Jim realize his destiny to die after he writes a bunch of shitty poetry. Not to be confused with, another trope that happens a lot in movies, which is the magical Negro or the manic pixie dream girl.
Yes, Trope Navajo shows up whenever Jim Morrison was having a big moment to bonk us upside the head that something significant was happening. I prefer not to have any version of Trope Navajo in a movie. I prefer to not even think something is a trope and to have it sneak up on me. We like to see storytelling handled in a subtle and original manner that eliminates any illusory need for trope Navajo and Giselle. For example, we'll say trope Navajo might as well have shown up here if we find something overly tropey, or wow, trope Navajo was like a million miles away from here. I'm really impressed by the subtlety in this.
And I want to be clear, we do not mean any offense to Native Americans. The offense was in Oliver Stone's filmic exploitation and in formulaic biopics and lazy symbolism in general.
I was just thinking about it the other afternoon, Sarah. I began to wonder if perhaps trope Navajo entered the mind of baby boomer Oliver Stone from all those heinously branded Native American sports mascots that the boomers grew up with. And he thought, I'm gonna invent this Navajo, at least I think the tribe is Navajo, as a mascot to show when Jim is having a deep moment.
We complain about the lazy symbolism in the Doors episode, but if you hear us referring to trope Navajo, that's where he comes from. He is symbolic of offensiveness as well. So we don't care for that characterization. And I'm wondering how and why Oliver Stone hasn't made a movie about Andrew Jackson. And that is a conversation for another day.
It seems right up his alley. Since we're not creating in a vacuum, Sarah, what are some podcasts that you really like and that may have been influential on you?
I have a couple that sort of really have captured my imagination of late, in addition to a couple that you have mentioned already. Behind the Bastards, which is hosted by Robert Evans. It's an amazing podcast, really well researched, really smart guy, and great perspective. I love We Hate Movies, which features 4 dudes talking about movies. They're very funny. They have a very funny Conqueror episode that I deliberately did not return to because I didn't want to accidentally steal anything from them for that, but they're really funny. Also a podcast called Again With This, which has been carefully dissecting episode after episode of 1990s TV shows. They started with Beverly Hills 90210, a show that I refer to constantly. I also listen to a lot of true crime. I'm a huge fan of Hollywood Crime Scene, which is hosted by 2 women who dissect really notable crimes in history of the film industry. And also, I'm a huge fan of anything that Michael Hobbs wants to do, whether that's If Books Could Kill or Maintenance Phase. He's an outstanding, very smart reporter. Anywhere he shows up, I'm interested in listening to what he has to say. What about you, Rena?
One of my favorite podcasts, as we mentioned, is How Did This Get Made, which I think both of us love and where we stole second opinion from. There is an episode of How Did This Get Made from around 2011 that I save to scratch up out of the internet on days when I'm having a really dark night of the soul. Maybe about every other year or so, because I want to ration out how much I listen to this particular episode so that it doesn't lose its punch. And that is the Leprechaun in the Hood episode of How Did This Get Made? Guest starring Kumail Nanjiani. I laugh until I cry every time I hear it. It never gets old, which is why I have it rationed at this point, and why I save it for really bad moments. There's this moment in there when Kumail Nanjiani says, I wanted 3 things from this film, Paul. I wanted to do the leprechaun rap, and he did. I wanted to see the leprechaun smoke weed, and he did. I wanted to hear the leprechaun refer to his gold as bling, and he did not.
I have an episode of How Did This Get Made that I return to every once in a while, which is the sleepaway camp episode. They spend about 15 minutes up top just trying to figure out the family and the prologue of that movie.
It was justifiable that took 15 minutes. I've watched that movie with you, and the family arrangement in sleepaway camp is confusing as hell.
It is. And there's a lot of really different choices being made in the same scenes by the actors, and it is a wild ride, and fortunately not a biopic. I also just want to mention here that I know about How Did This Get Made thanks to you and the time that you stayed in our house for Superstorm Sandy. I'm glad that you gave me the gift of that podcast.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you, Sarah. I also love the British History podcast. The guy who makes that started in about 2010 and got to 1066 around last year. He's very thorough.
Wow.
Then there are the podcasts that inspired our rating system, the Rexipods, and out of all of those, I love Pontifex the best. I love the rapport between the hosts, Fry and Bree. Recently, I've been listening to Tyler Mahan Coe's Cocaine and Rhinestones. Country is not my favorite genre, but I love his storytelling. I have listened to nearly every episode of Andrew Hickey's History of Rock Music in 500 Songs. And like I said, it was one of the things that inspired me to not care about a clean rating, because Andrew Hickey is always saying, I can't say this and keep my clean rating. It's just annoying. It's rock and roll. People cuss. I don't care about your kids. And then also, not every episode of Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, but he did a series on the Mongols a long time ago that I've listened to about 4 or 5 times, and it's fantastic. They were so violent and so hardcore, and it's just brutal. It's fascinating. I also wanted to shout out WTF with Mark Maron, which has periodically been a form of therapy. I rarely listen to it now, but there were a few years in my life when I listened to hundreds of episodes. I never stopped loving Mark or his podcast. It's just that after hundreds of episodes, I gradually hit a saturation point where I shifted focus.
So what's next for us?
We lay out our viewing schedule months in advance to try to get a variety of people, themes, and eras in both history and filmmaking. At the moment, I have it laid out for about the next 52 weeks. We tinker with it periodically, and it's always a work in progress, getting that balance. At this point, the list is about 12 pages in 12-point single space. So the movie that you're hoping we'll do is probably in there somewhere.
There's also a short list of movies that we are absolutely never doing that we are not going to share, because at some point that may create a demand for them, and then we'll have to deal with a bunch of trolls. So for future plans, we're recording this in May of 2024. We just put out a sample pack of our first 5 episodes, and as of June 4th, 2024, we're going to be on a weekly Tuesday release schedule. So that's the official launch. We'll be starting off with Pride Month. We'll do at least a couple of films around the Olympics. We're planning on doing Coco before Chanel, or a similar film for Fashion Weeks. And we'll have theme months coming up at some point. For example, we had the idea to do And Then They All Died in a Plane Crash month, but we have this year pretty much planned out.
I'm happy about what we're doing. We've created the podcast that I always wished existed, but couldn't find until I thought of it and started making it. I've been listening to podcasts since around 2006, and this one combines all my favorite elements in an idiosyncratic mix that makes me happy. We are making a complicated Valentine to a complicated genre. I'm delighted to be on this journey with you.
I love that. I am having such a good time doing this with you. And also just kind of being forced out of my occasional lump of just watching Office reruns every night instead of seeking out new entertainment or being willing to watch new films. It's been really fun to explore some of the things I haven't seen before and go back and see some things that I haven't watched in a really long time and had really faulty opinions of. I'm having so much fun creating this show with you and picking apart things that have been held sacred by so many.
Me too. And who knows, maybe someday there will be a version of Lincoln with a dinosaur in it.
He's sleeping for 8 hours, or trying to. And if anyone could sell that, Daniel Day-Lewis could totally do it. And Spielberg's right there. He can just walk one of those real dinosaurs over from Jurassic Park and have that dinosaur standing right there. Did a dinosaur help draft the Emancipation Proclamation? I don't know, maybe.
And that's our introduction show. Who are we and what are we doing?
If you liked our show, please tell a friend about us and leave a 5-star rating on the iTunes Store, Spotify, or whatever platform you listen to us on. We hear that it helps.
See you soon, and thank you so much for tuning in.
Bye, everyone.